Well, it's been brewing for days, maybe even years, but what's now obvious is that Australians walking to the ballot box at the next election will again be asked to make a choice on climate and energy policy. And that choice will be pretty stark over the next 5 years. Labor, with its stated aim to cut emissions by 43% in 2030, the coalition under Peter Dutton abandoning that target before coming back to address it in government if it wins. Well, this might have been predictable, but the fact it's been declared won't detract from the ferocity of the debate from here on. A debate over climate, the economy and cost of living all jumbled in together. So we'll hear from a number of political groupings on this Tuesday. Coming to you from Canberra, recognising traditional custodians around here, I'm Greg Jennett. You're watching Afternoon Briefing. We are on standby today to take you to a live media conference the Prime Minister has called in the Blue Room here at Parliament House. We believe his purpose in calling it might be twofold. One, to outline some details of the visit by the Chinese Premier to Australia in a few days' time, and who knows, knowing Anthony Albanese, perhaps also to run some commentary on the decision today that we just alluded to by Peter Dutton concerning 2030 emissions reduction targets, or the failure to have any on the part of the coalition in its run-up to the next election. That will actually underpin further discussions we have throughout this hour. Also joining us a bit later on in the program, a new appointee to work with the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission. This will be Alison Scott, I should say, an Indigenous woman from Western Australia who'll bring her own painful and direct experience of domestic violence and abuse. Apparently, this perspective is too often lost in high-level talks on domestic violence, and we'll hear from her what is often raw and confronting versions from a victim perspective. That's Alison Scott a little later in the hour. But just to fill some time for you as we wait for the Prime Minister to emerge, our Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jennett is with us here in the studio. Yes, and I've touched very briefly there, Stephen, on the purpose of the Prime Minister. What do we know in the broad about Li Qiang's visit to Australia?
Well, we know a little bit more now, Greg. The Prime Minister's just put out a press release that runs through some of the details of the trip. We know it will go for about 4 days and it will take in 3 cities. So first of all, Premier Li is going to head to Adelaide. And then after that, we expect that he will also head to Canberra and then finally to Perth. So 4 days, 3 cities, a bit of a whirlwind, and I think the Prime Minister's stepping up now.
Good afternoon. The Premier of the People's Republic of China, Li Qiang, will visit Australia as a guest of government from Saturday 15 June to Tuesday 18 June. This will be the first visit to Australia by a Chinese Premier since 2017 and represents another important step in stabilising our relationship with China. The Premier and I will hold the annual leaders meeting here at Parliament House in Canberra. It will be followed by a state lunch here in the Great Hall, attended by members of the government, the opposition, as well as business and community leaders. Premier Li will also travel to Adelaide prior to Canberra and then on to Perth. The Premier and I will engage with Australian and Chinese business leaders at the 7th Australia-China CEO Roundtable. This will make a valuable contribution to strengthening relationships between business leaders in China and Australia. As people know, China represents around about 25% of our export in terms of a destination. We'll also acknowledge, of course, the deep contribution of the more than 1 million members of the Chinese Australian community to our nation's multicultural success story. Premier Li's visit to Australia follows my visit to Beijing in November last year. Welcoming the Chinese Premier to Australia is an opportunity for us to advance our interests by demonstrating our national values, our people's qualities and our economy's strengths. Australia continues to pursue a stable and direct relationship with China, with dialogue at its core. Our approach has been patient, calibrated and deliberate. Cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and engage in our national interest. And overwhelmingly, the impediments that were there to our trade have been removed in recent times, and we're seeing the benefit of that trade through our export of our coal, our wine, our barley, our other products, including most recently the decision when it came to meat here in Australia. Can I also make some comments before taking questions about Peter Dutton's rather extraordinary abandonment of any pretence of having a climate policy. His nuclear fantasy will result in higher power prices and more unstable energy grid and rising emissions. No 2030 target means walking out of the Paris Agreement. That is very clear. And if you walk out of the Paris Agreement, you're left standing with Libya, Yemen and Iran. That is not the company that Australia should want to keep. We know that the consequences of that for our relationships in our region and around the world with our closest allies will be ones that are regrettable, to say the least. Peter Dutton, after that announcement, within minutes, you had Senator Bragg out there saying something very different. And it's clear that there hasn't been any proper process to determine the Coalition's policy on this issue. Peter Dutton is divisive, the Coalition are divided, and there's no detail about what they would pursue. They're the 3 Ds of the Coalition: divisive, divided, detail, which gives them a big F for fail when it comes to climate policy. So instead of chasing investment in new industries with new opportunities and new jobs, he's chasing them away. No action until 2040 means energy shortfalls. It means higher costs, and it's something that Australia should not pursue. The Coalition had 22 different energy policies when they were in government and didn't land one of them. Now they have a number of policies over recent days, but it's very clear that they can't be taken seriously on an issue that is important to Australians today, but which is particularly important as an intergenerational equity issue as well. It's important in terms of our international relationships, but it's important in terms of our environment, but importantly as well at a time where the entire globe is moving towards this economic transformation. It's an abandonment of the opportunities that are there for Australia to benefit from climate change action with new growth and new jobs and new industries. Peter Dutton is afraid of the future, and therefore he can't seize the opportunities which are there. Happy to take some questions. Hang on. People who shout out never get the first one. There you go, and then we'll go to Andrew.
Prime Minister, you said that the projection for the Energy Department of getting to 42% doesn't include the measures in the most recent budget. Do those measures put us now on track to meet 43, or is it still leaving Australia short?
Well, we've said we're very much on track. I note Peter Dutton's absurd comments that were made in his press conference. What we've done is adopt as a parliament and as a nation clear climate policies that put in place a legislated net zero by 2050, that put in place a legislated 43% reduction by 2030, and have a process of accountability and transparency through the Climate Change Authority. That authority released information in December, which is available for you to have a look at. That projected that we're on track at that point to 42%, given the policies that were implemented. Now, since then, We've had production tax credits for critical minerals, for green hydrogen. We, of course, will continue to look towards policies that make a difference, that make sense for our economy, but also make sense for our environment. For Peter Dutton to walk away from any 2030 commitment, to be clear, is walking away from the Paris Agreement. He himself has said that in the past. Angus Taylor made it very clear. Well, let me give Labor a bit of news. The Paris Agreement requires a 2030 target. Then he said further on, you can't be in the Paris Agreement without a 2030 target. In Hansard in Parliament, 24th of February 2021, the first quote was 19th of October 2019. And it is quite extraordinary that there are people here who ask me day after day, from the day I was elected leader of the Labor Party in 2019, what our 2030 target would be. What we did was we went away, we did the hard work, we did the analysis, and that's why we have now legislated that target. Andrew.
Prime Minister, Peter Dutton's calculations seems to be on the basis of growing anxiety about energy prices and cost of living. Do you concede that with greater ambition comes higher household costs?
Not at all. If we don't, what I would assert is that unless you take action on climate change, unless you address issues such as supply, then you will have higher costs under what Peter Dutton is proposing. Peter Dutton is proposing abandoning the targets, abandoning investment certainty, which will lead to less investment in the lead up to 2040, at some time when this nuclear fantasy will take place. The business community have been very clear. And when we announced our position, we did so standing with the Business Council of Australia and other business leaders who all have been asking for certainty, that certainty that Peter Dutton is getting rid of.
Prime Minister, the government will have to set its 2035 targets by February next year. The Climate Change Authority earlier this year was commissioned to advise the government, and its initial consultations suggested a target of between 65% and 75% by 2035 could be feasible. Are you confident that Australia has the infrastructure in place to roll out the renewables needed should such a target be required?
Well, let's be very clear. That target has not been set, and the Climate Change Authority have not given advice to the government. What we have is a very clear 2030 target. We have policies, including the capacity investment scheme, the safeguard mechanism, the policies that we have in place to drive that investment, to drive that certainty through the economy. And that is what we are focused on.
Mr. about on the China visit next week, will you be using the opportunity to raise the plight of young hen June? And whilst the Premier's in South Australia, which has a sizable lobster industry, would you like to see an announcement on that final trade sanction being lifted from the Chinese?
Well, I certainly would like to see that any impediments to our lobsters and crayfish, our magnificent seafood being removed. Australia has an interest in trade with China. China has an interest in receiving our magnificent goods because of their quality. So this is a win-win. So we will continue to put forward our arguments there, as we will continue to pursue Australia's interests, including Yanheng-Jun. As you say, we always raise those issues in formal discussions which will take place. They'll take place here in less than a week's time now, but we'll raise other issues of Australia's national interests as well. Just here.
Prime Minister, just also on the China visit, US and Canada, the governments are both considering, in terms of TikTok, potentially banning it. They cite serious concerns about democracy. Is our intelligence the same? And if so, why aren't we going down the same path? And if we're not, why not?
Well, I'm surprised you asked me to reveal what our intelligence should be at a press conference.
No, I'm asking for the government's position on
Well,
TikTok.
our position hasn't changed.
Prime Minister.
Mark
Prime
Rowley.
Minister, what will your message to Premier Lee be about the recent incidents involving Australian military personnel in the South China Sea and elsewhere, and also on Taiwan?
On the former, the message will be that they were inappropriate, and he, of course, will be very aware of Australia's position, which is that Australia was engaged in legitimate international activity, and that should never have occurred because it was dangerous and it shouldn't have happened, and it should not happen again. So we will certainly be putting that forward. And the second, Mark, was? Taiwan. Our position is to support the status quo when it comes to Taiwan, that is in the international community's interests for that to occur.
Prime Minister, regarding
Just here.
Just on another matter, regarding religious discrimination, are those reforms dead? Where are they at?
Well, the coalition have received a copy of the draft legislation. We await a response.
Prime Minister, last week the bipartisan moment in Parliament about certain types of protests. Your comments were directed particularly at protests that block electorate offices. However, people who weren't following the speech closely, you obviously spoke about justice for Palestinians, but for people who weren't following closely and they saw how that bipartisan moment rolled out, might have interpreted as a broader message about pro-Palestine protests more generally. Will you have any message today to people in the broader Australian community who are concerned about the suffering of Palestinians? And secondly, will you affirm that the majority of pro-Palestine protest activity in Australia for weeks has been peaceful?
In a democracy, peaceful protest has an important role for people to be able to demonstrate their views. And there is a great deal of concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It's one that the Australian government shares. It's one where the Australian government has clearly voted for ceasefires in UN processes. I've issued media releases myself along those lines, together with the Prime Minister of Canada and the Prime Minister of New Zealand. It is important as well, as I said in Parliament, that how people conduct themselves will reflect on the cause which they wish to pursue. And people being blockaded from visiting their local Member of Parliament with Greens senators, and people will have seen the footage which they themselves have posted, such as Senator Faruqi and others, outside offices encouraging that blockading. I don't know how stopping someone getting assistance on Medicare or Social Security or immigration, people who turn up to electorate offices, are an important part of the democratic process that we have. But importantly as well, they tend to be the most vulnerable people. You don't turn up to an electorate office to get support. You're not there for a political purpose. That's not the role that they played. That's what elected members of Parliament do. And those people, whether it be that or throwing bricks at windows, or whether it be painting of offices or the US consulate or other buildings, do nothing to advance the cause.
On the Premier's visit, he's going to be going to Western Australia. There's probably going to be a critical minerals component to that. What is the Albanese government's approach to Chinese investment in critical minerals?
Well, we have an approach consistent with our foreign investment rules. Foreign investment has a role to play. In Australia, we do it on a case-by-case basis, considering the national interest. Certainly Chinese engagement, including with the resources sector, has been important for growth in not just Australia, obviously, with the benefit of those resources, particularly from Western Australia, but other states as well. That has played an important role in what has been a remarkable uplifting of people out of poverty in China over recent decades as well.
Right, what is the government doing to fix the problems riddling the ABF's Cape Class fleet, given it's basically affecting their ability to patrol the borders?
Well, the ABF have made very clear they continue to engage. Operation Sovereign Borders is in place. We continue to ensure that people who arrive in Australia on an unauthorised basis won't be allowed to settle here, and that's precisely the policy that my government has put in place. And I note as well that the people involved with Operation Sovereign Borders have confirmed that funding has never been higher than it is now under my government.
Prime Minister, when the Premier heads to Adelaide, are you expecting any announcement about two well-known residents in Adelaide, Wong Wong and Fooney? Will there be a permanent panda presence in South Australia?
If I answered that, then there might be a preempting of what may or may not occur. I repeat what I said in Shanghai when I was asked. My government is pro-panda. We like panda bears, and so do, I reckon, Australians. But there's been no announcement on that. But I think that the presence of those pandas at Adelaide up to now has been something that's brought a great deal of joy to families who've been able to visit, and it's also been a major attraction, of course, for the Adelaide Zoo. Yeah.
Prime Minister.
And then Katina. Yeah.
Prime Minister, Noel Pearson has described the management of funds established by the Keating government in the wake of Mabo.
Sorry?
Sorry, Noel Pearson has described the management of government funds established in the wake of Mabo to assist Indigenous people dispossessed of native title as neglectful. Attorney General Mark Dreyfus last week announced a review into native title, referring that up to the Law Reform Commission. But should that be looked at more broadly, given that some analysis suggests that a significant amount of money, or Indigenous people lost out on a significant amount of money from these funds over the past 30 years because of the way that they were managed and the restrictions placed on them?
Well, you've answered some of the question yourself by indicating that some of the information's been referred off by the Attorney General for further inquiry. I say this about native title, is that it has brought considerable resources and benefit and employment to Indigenous communities. Katina?
Minister, we keep hearing, and I'm sure you do too, that cost of living is absolutely the top issue for people. Do you think that Australians really want a seventh election fought on climate change?
No, I don't think they do. I think that Australians at the last election voted for Labor candidates and for other candidates who said that they would take climate change seriously. It is, quite frankly, a lost decade that we had under the former government, with 22 policies announced and none of them landed. Australians want government to get on with the business of dealing with climate change, because they know that whilst it's a challenge, it's also an opportunity. They also know that climate change is real. They've experienced it with bushfires, with floods, with increased numbers of and intensity of extreme weather events, which is what the science told us would happen here and around the world. And what's more, they also want Australia to engage in a constructive way, because that's in our national interest with our Pacific neighbours and with our friends and allies. It is remarkable that the lesson that Peter Dutton appears to have got from the last election is to be worse on climate than Scott Morrison was. It's to double down and to continue to want to engage in these issues in a way that doesn't look for any sensible way forward. If you take Peter Dutton at his own word, he speaks about nuclear reactors somehow being the solution when we know that that won't happen. Even if everything went his way, couldn't happen before 2040, and we know is 8 times the cost of the renewables which are firmed. This is not a sensible policy. This is an abandonment, and it's because he's incapable of taking any decisions which are against the elements in his own party, and it would appear that he's one of them, who remain climate change deniers. Well, the people on the south coast from here know the consequences. Of course, we've always had extreme weather events in Australia, but we know that they're more intense than they've ever been, and we know they're more frequent, and we know as well that we need the whole world to engage and to act. For Peter Dutton to put this position and to put us outside the Paris Accord is an abrogation of the responsibility that mainstream political leaders have in Australia in 2024. Thanks very much.
Okay, live from the Blue Room here at Parliament House, that was the Prime Minister outlining some elements of the official visit to Australia by Li Qiang, the Chinese Premier, arriving Saturday, leaving on Tuesday. There is some significance to this visit because of the lengthy hiatus by senior leadership of the Chinese government in recent years. Wang Yi, the Foreign Minister, was here reasonably recently, though. Let's just recap some of those elements. We'll get to climate change a little later in our hour today, but our Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jennett is still with us here. Yes, Stephen, the details I think have all been published online, but the questions kind of took us to the key issues, don't they? Economic coercion largely resolved on the trade front. Chang'e successfully resolved. Yang Hengjun less so. What else is left to be achieved in this visit, apart from panda diplomacy?
Yeah, well, we got a brief answer from the Prime Minister, who stubbornly refused to say there whether we might get some sort of news about the 2 pandas that are stubbornly refusing to breed in Adelaide Zoo. Look, I don't think more seriously that there are necessarily sky-high ambitions for this trip, simply because, as you say, a lot of that groundwork has already been done, and the low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better phrase, has already been plucked. We've seen now the vast bulk of those trade restrictions removed. The only one that still remains, of course, really are those rock lobsters, which still face barriers getting in. On top of that, we've also seen essentially the resumption of dialogue. So what's left? Well, the stuff that's really difficult, the areas where Australia and China have fundamentally different views and different objectives. Now, the Prime Minister there was asked about Taiwan. He was asked about those recent military confrontations that we've seen between both China and Australia in places like the Yellow Sea, as well as in the South China Sea. And he really did just recite the government's existing positions on all of those fronts. On Taiwan, he said any change to the status quo would be terrible. On China's behaviour in the South China Sea and the Yellow Sea, he said it was unacceptable. So you don't get a sense of a Prime Minister who's expecting necessarily huge breakthroughs in some of these very difficult areas. But dialogue's important.
It is, and you'll be across each and every element, I think, of this visit as it unfolds. Stephen Jennett, really appreciate your time with us today. And yeah, so look, just briefly on domestic policy, as the Prime Minister touched on it there, I guess we can say buckle up for more on energy prices and CO2 emissions. That much is clear from the Prime Minister taking on this issue for the second day running now. Also, on the matter of the Chinese Premier's visit, this was among the topics that we took up with the Resources Minister, Madeleine King, who joined us earlier from Perth after delivering a speech, I should say, on production subsidies for critical minerals firms. Madeline King, welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. Good to have you joining us from Perth. I think you're in Townsville last time we spoke. Now, you've given a speech to a room full of resources executives there in Perth about the budget's critical minerals production tax incentive. I guess you're trying to rally support for it. You stress that these tax breaks should attract bipartisan support. Has any critical minerals firm or investor said to you since the budget that they wouldn't invest in this $17 billion scheme if it doesn't attract enduring bipartisan support?
Well, thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me on today. Can I just say I don't really need to raise support for the critical minerals production incentive because I have support for it. The industry itself has helped design the production tax credit. We've worked on it for nearly a year. It has a lot of support in Western Australia and Queensland, I might add, the two states that will produce the bulk of their resources, but also the other states as well. So there's already a lot of support for the production tax credits. Of course, Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor have chosen not to support it, and it's a real shame, and I hope they reconsider because it sends a message that the alternative government is not serious about developing the critical minerals and rare earths industry. The truth is, this Albanese Labor government is very serious about it. It's a big undertaking. I've said before, it's literally a national mission to get the critical minerals and rare earths industry up and going so it can dovetail into important supply chains right around the world.
But you did say in the speech that you genuinely did not expect the federal coalition to land where it has on this. And again, I'll go back to the word bipartisanship. You kind of hanker for it. I know you say you don't need support because you built it anyway, but it does sound like a part of you still wants to bed this down with the coalition rather than any other party in the Senate. Is that true?
Yeah, I absolutely would prefer for Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor to reconsider their anti-Western Australian and anti-Queensland stance and back the critical minerals production tax incentive. I was surprised on the budget and reply night when they, oh, actually it was on budget night, wasn't it? They really went out very quickly and you know, shot this down in their inimitable negative way without really considering it. But I did think the next day they might read the policy, might understand it better, might understand that it's $17 billion over 14 years to grow a new resources sector in this country and reconsider their position. They have failed to do that. There is still chance, there are still opportunities for them to back the resources sector, and I hope that they do that.
All right. You also said in your speech that the Biden administration, with which you have had dealings in October last year and in March of this year, urged Australia to, quote, protect its critical minerals and rare earths. Now, protect has quite a laden meaning in the world of trade and investment. Protect from whom?
Well, it's about protecting supply chains and about securing supply chains. So what we know is that we're in a global competition for rare earths and critical minerals and the processed outcomes of those natural resources which this country holds so much of. So when I say protect, I mean about building our capability to process them and make sure we have that capacity to make that future here in Australia. So we do want to supply to our friends and neighbours. The US is a very important partner for Australia, and as we know, critical minerals and rare earths are vitally important for wind turbines and electric vehicles, but they're also really important for defence applications. And so it becomes a matter of national security to make sure we make these things here and we make them so that we can work with our international partners.
I asked that question, the previous question, Madeline, because we are expecting formal confirmation soon that the Chinese Premier Li Qiang will visit Australia after New Zealand with a side leg to Perth. Now, whether you get to speak to him or not, he will no doubt ask for what Beijing has asked for from Australia for many years now, and that is for more open access to Australian investments. Will you or anyone in the government tell him that that is not happening? In fact, quite the contrary, foreign investment rules are being tightened here?
Well, the Foreign Investment Review Board is a really important institution for this country, and having its oversight of foreign investment from any country whatsoever is really important so that we have a social acceptance of the need for foreign investment, so that the community can have confidence that that investment has some oversight over it. And so without the Foreign Investment Review Board, there can be difficulties in trusting that international investment which has built this country. The Chinese have invested in our resources sector for many years. You think back to Bob Hawke standing with the then Premier of China out at Mount Chena to develop the Rio Tinto iron ore project. Really important moments have included investment from China, but just as resources industry has benefited from investment from Japan and also South Korea and the US and the UK even. So all international investment is important, and the FIRB has a really important role to do it in that whole process.
Yeah, we may not have much visibility on all the discussions with the Premier. No doubt foreign investment will come up. Thank you for addressing that, Madeleine King. Now, very explicitly from Peter Dutton's own mouth today, we've had confirmation that the coalition will be abandoning the government's 2030 target because it says it's unachievable. In the interest, well, I'll get a general reaction from you first of all on that, because Peter Dutton has explicitly confirmed this in a doorstop. I do have a further question about progress towards your targets, but what should flow from this announcement?
Yeah, well, there's no end to what's unachievable for the Liberal Party of this country and for Peter Dutton, and that's a really sad state of affairs for the Liberal Party in this country and the wider coalition. He underestimates the ability of the Australian people, in my view. He doesn't think we can achieve a critical minerals and rare earths industry, as he is not backing the production tax credits. So my reaction to that is, of course, one of disappointment, but also, you know, it's so counterproductive to the progress of this country and how our country can actively participate in a decarbonised global economy, let alone just decarbonising our own economy. We have a really important role to step up globally in net zero discussions, but also literally making the things that will get the world to a net zero position. And by walking out on these targets, showing the distinct lack of ambition for this country, Peter Dutton is abandoning that.
All right. Well, I'm interested in the role of carbon capture and storage here, Madeleine King, especially in the Great Artesian Basin. You will recall when you were in Rockhampton, we did discuss this, and we were told by other ministers present there in Beef Week that it was a concern in Queensland. The Future Gas Strategy had most of the Great Artesian Basin mapped as, quote, highly suitable for CCS. Now that the Queensland portion of the Great Artesian Basin will, under state law, forever ban CCS, will this impair the development of that technology under federal policy?
Yeah. Well, I want to be clear that state governments can make these choices, and I have no objection to that. Carbon capture, use and storage is just one of the means by which we can seek to decarbonise our economy. It's far from the only one, but as the International Energy Agency has said and the International Panel on Climate Change has said, we won't reach net zero without carbon capture and storage. Now, the federal scientific institutions do an overlay of the whole country and look at the prospects for CCS. And then it's up to state governments to, of course, look at other community factors in their decision-making process. So,
but you've just lost a very large tract there, haven't you, with this announcement from Queensland?
Well, there are significant alternatives for CCS, and I want to add that they're still being explored as well. Although there are 9 million tonnes of CO2 stored off Barrow Island, we know that for this technology to be successful, the industry needs to get more runs on the board on CCS. So there is a great deal of potential in offshore jurisdictions for CCS, and we've got companies working on that right now through our offshore greenhouse gas storage acreage releases. I'm just simply not going to pick a fight with state governments over this, because I respect their connection to their state and to the communities within them.
But you could end up with a situation, couldn't you, where other states follow suit, as Queensland has, and suddenly your onshore options are extremely limited?
Well, that may be the case, but fortunately, of course, we have extensive offshore options.
All right. Madeleine King, thank you for that. I'm sure we'll be coming back to this and other matters when next we speak. Always great to have you on the program.
Thanks so much, Greg. Appreciate that.
Well, from one West Australian to another now. Before we knew we were going to hear from the Prime Minister during our program, we'd arranged to get West Australian Teal Independent Kate Chaney in with us, and I'm pleased to say she joins us now. Thank you for your patience today, Kate. The afternoon didn't quite roll the way we intended, but that happens with the Prime Minister. Why don't we start out on climate? A no coalition 2030 target until sometime after the election. Peter Dutton has confirmed this today. It makes it easier for you to defend Curtin, doesn't it? This is the ground that the Teals want to fight on?
Well, this, I think, shows that Peter Dutton learnt absolutely nothing from the 2022 election. And by pulling back from the 2030 target and saying, we're not even going to tell you what we think the target should be until after the election, it just positions the government as not being a viable alternative, the opposition as not being a viable alternative government if it's not prepared to take seriously the major challenge of this generation.
Is it the abandonment of Teal seats? Is that what it looks like to you?
Well, to some extent, I'm less concerned about what it means for seats. I'm more concerned about what it means for the country. And when one of the two supposedly, viable governments is saying we're not serious about this, it's really bad for not only the certainty that business needs and the investment community needs, but also for anyone who's concerned about future generations, which is a lot of the population. So I think it's really, really bad for the country that he's stepping back from that international commitment. It also exposes us to ridicule on the global stage. And if we want to have any leadership globally, then we need to be doing our bit.
But no more than that, is it? I mean, ridicule is significant, of course, but there are no other consequences, are there, for Australia within the UN's climate framework?
Well, I think, international rules often depend on soft power. And while there may be no direct consequence, it's significant for our standing. It's also significant for attracting investment dollars in the really important industries that we need to establish so that we do have a role in an ongoing net zero global economy. If we are just holding on with white knuckles to the industries of old instead of actively showing that the world that we are committed to transforming, we will pay the price for that.
All right, but let's talk about the other major party of government, the ALP, obviously the incumbent government. It says it's very confident, unquote, that it's going to make it to its 43% target. Are you?
Look, whether we make it to 43 or not, we need to be setting ambitious targets. So I would have liked to see that 43% be a more ambitious target. If we fall slightly short of it, then that is on the government, but it cannot be used as an excuse to throw our hands in the air and abandon the target. We know we need to go as fast as we can and decarbonise. So any movement in that direction is one that I will be encouraging, and we need to keep the pressure on.
And the government then moves on itself to settling the next block of targets, 2035. This is work it will do over the next 6 to 8 months. Kate Chaney, what should that be, in your view, even a ballpark figure?
Well, it definitely needs to be at the ambitious end. We here in Western Australia, in my electorate in Curtin, we're having a forest collapse event at the moment because we had 8 months with no rain. and there are dead trees all over the place. We are seeing the very real impacts of climate change. So we need to be setting ambitious targets to ensure that we are part of a future net zero economy and that we are contributing globally to reducing the impacts, some of which may be irreversible. It is urgent, and I'll be pushing for a pretty ambitious 2035 target.
All right, well, we've got a few months to talk about that. Why don't we jump forward to international affairs and how they intersect? Back here in Australia, Kate, social cohesion around the Israel-Hamas war. There's been damage done to parliamentarians' offices. Prime Minister just spoke on that in his media conference here. Just as a matter of record, has yours suffered damage in recent times?
I haven't suffered damage in my electoral office, and I support people's right to peaceful protest, but it is absolutely heartbreaking to see this tragedy unfolding overseas and that turning into this polarised domestic political point-scoring exercise here, when we really need to be uniting our voices, using what influence Australia has to bring this conflict to an end, which I think is what everyone wants. Everyone would like to see a ceasefire and the hostages returned, and we cannot regress into this anger-driven point-scoring battle that we're seeing between leaders at the moment.
With that in mind, what significance do you place or what optimism do you derive from the UN Security Council vote, which has happened there in New York in the last 24 hours or so? A three-step process towards ceasefire, hostage release and reconstruction of Gaza. Does this give you confidence that a deal may in fact be there for the taking now?
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction, and I'd be kidding myself to think that I had any particular insight to the thinking of the Netanyahu government or Hamas. But definitely I think it is what the international community needs to be doing, is finding the common ground and the things that we can agree on, which is that we do need to progress to a ceasefire, the return of hostages and a longer-term plan. And I think it's encouraging to see the UN Security Council pushing in that direction. Yeah,
I'm sure that's been the conclusion reached around the globe. Well, as far as I've been able to read it is. Kate Chaney, more we could have discussed today, but for reasons I've already outlined, our time's been shortened a little. We'll catch up again soon.
Great, thanks, Greg.
Okay, now the political forces will line up as they have before on climate policy. That is to say, we'll have the coalition on one side, Labor somewhere around the middle and the Greens much further out to the other side. We spoke to Greens leader Adam Bandt from his Melbourne electorate office about a number of the Daily News topics a little earlier. Adam Bandt, welcome back to the program. Why don't we start with the coalition confirming today that it won't have a 2030 emissions reduction target in place before the next election. Now, the Greens supported the Climate Change Act of 2022, which locked in 43% for 2030. What consequences would or should flow for a Dutton coalition government if it breached or didn't meet the terms of that act?
Well, this is a bad announcement from Peter Dutton. It's now clear that neither Liberal nor Labor are committed to the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global heating to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, which our Pacific Island neighbours and the Greens are fighting for. The 2-degree goal in the Paris Agreement is really crucial. The scientists say if the planet heats by more than that, then climate change will become unstoppable and run away, and nothing that our kids or our grandkids will do will be able to rein it in. Labor's target has us overshooting that Paris goal of 2 degrees. So I saw the Prime Minister out on the weekend crying Paris crocodile tears about Peter Dutton's announcement when Labor's own targets are unscientific and won't have us meeting the Paris goals. But now the Liberals aren't even pretending to care anymore. The target is in legislation. The target needs to be increased. And neither Liberal nor Labor are going to meet that Paris Agreement goal because they both want to keep opening up new coal and gas mines. After the next election, especially if we're in a minority parliament, the Greens will use our power to push not just to lift the target, but to do the critical thing of stop opening new coal and gas mines. Otherwise, we just won't meet it at all.
I will take you to further questions about the Albanese government's trajectory and its options before and after the next election, should it be re-elected. But yes, just wondering once again about the act that locked down 43%. If it doesn't have any domestic political consequences, why was it passed into law in the first place if it's purely symbolic and, doesn't hold a government to account?
Well, I think it would be a binding piece of legislation that obviously needs to be increased, and you'd have to ask the coalition how they think they can get around a piece of legislation that is already enforced. But sadly, what we're seeing, when we worked with the government on that legislation, it was clear that it was meant to be a floor, not a ceiling. The scientists were very, very clear that Australia would need to do a lot more to contribute to the Paris Agreement goal of stopping global heating. And sadly, what we've seen over the last couple of years of this government, and now reinforced by Peter Dutton, is that we're going to go to the next election with Peter Dutton saying that they want nuclear plus more coal and gas, Labor saying they want renewables plus more coal and gas, and only the Greens saying, no, we've got to stop opening up coal and gas mines. So I think the trajectory at the next election is now becoming clearer, and it's becoming clearer, especially over the last couple of months in Parliament, that Labor's just as committed to opening up new coal and gas mines as Peter Dutton is.
All right. Well, you're saying that the Albanese government won't make its own 43, and yet it does have to settle on a 2035 target later this year, early next. Of course, the Greens are going to be, and have all along said they'd be far more ambitious on 2035, but it can't be credibly met, can it, if 2030 wasn't met, and you're telling us it won't be?
Well, part of the reason that pollution is now up under this government and we're not on track to meet even Labor's weak targets is Labor's committed to coal and gas still, and they're continuing to open new coal and gas projects. We've had the approval of 13 new coal and gas projects, and there are many more in the pipeline. And what the data and the reports make crystal clear is the thing that is undoing all the work of Australians who are putting solar panels on their roofs and making the switch to electric vehicles is this stubborn increase in pollution from gas in particular. Now, gas is as dirty as coal, and the data is making it crystal clear that if we keep opening new gas mines in Australia at the same time as opening new coal mines, we're not going to meet even the weak targets, let alone the science-based targets. And it's that we're pushing to say is the focus. Why is it that the targets aren't on track to be met? It's because Labor and the Liberals keep backing more coal and gas.
Now, you've mentioned in our conversation here, Adam, the scenario of a minority government and the Greens using its leverage on the government of the day, and I think we were talking there hypothetically about a minority Albanese government. If it settled on a 2035 target before the next election and sought to lock it down in this parliament, clearly you're signalling the Greens wouldn't regard their ballpark numbers as satisfactory. So the question is, would you pass in the Senate 2035 targets this side of the next election?
I think any increased 2035 target from Labor won't be worth the paper it's written on if they're also continuing to open new coal and gas mines. That is what the data is showing us at the moment. You can't meet your targets if you're also opening new coal and gas mines. If you've got your foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time, you go nowhere. So I think at the last election, people voted for action on climate. There's been a great degree of disappointment at Labor's future gas strategy, for example, where they've said that they want to keep gas as well as coal in the system to 2050 and beyond. I mean, Labor said we were supposed to be at zero emissions in 2050, but they want gas to go past 2050, and they're approving coal mines to go past 2050 as well. So I think that is where the focus will be, and I think what you're going to see at the next election there's a lot of people voting to say, hey, hang on, Labor, this isn't what we thought we'd get. We're pretty disappointed that you want to keep opening coal and gas mines, that you're backing gas as much as Scott Morrison. We want no new coal and gas mines.
That sounds like a no then for unsatisfactory 35 targets in Australian law before the next election. Is that what I'm hearing here?
Well, what we're saying back to Labor is that having worked with them and given them the benefit of the doubt by passing legislation and securing some big gains along the way, we managed to stop about half of the new coal and gas mines in the pipeline. What's become clear to us is that Labor is now hell-bent on opening the remainder of the coal and gas that's in the system, that's in the pipeline. And we're saying you can't do it. Like the scientists are saying you can't do it. You can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it. And I think whatever Labor bowls up next is going to be viewed very sceptically by a public that has just seen Labor open up coal and gas mines hand over fist and now want to open up even more.
All right, let's move on. I'm sure we'll have many more discussions on that movable feast of targets and legislation beyond the next election, if not before it. Israel, Gaza now, Adam Bant, we've seen the UN Security Council vote 14-0 with Russia abstaining for a ceasefire and hostage release agreement. If this was accepted into further talks between Israel and Hamas, would you support a moratorium on further protests here in Australia that Greens have supported, including outside parliamentary electorate offices?
Look, this is an important step forward from the UN Security Council. The Greens, from the beginning, have been calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, not something with an asterisk attached to it, but a full ceasefire, because the slaughter that we have been seeing in Gaza is reaching the stage of massive humanitarian catastrophe. And as to why people are taking to the streets, like what we're seeing is this. There are hundreds of thousands of people across the country who have been peacefully protesting to call for an end to the invasion. And that has a tradition in Australia. For many people who are participating in this protest, this is important to them as the protests against the Iraq War or even the Vietnam War. And they are calling for our government to put pressure to bear on the Israeli government to stop the invasion. And I think what you're going to see, Greg, is that these aren't protests that some politician or another is able to start or stop. They're expression of anger and frustration from people who want the government to do something, who want the government to move beyond words and actually put pressure on the Israeli government to stop the invasion. And I think you're going to see those protests continue until our government takes some concrete steps, like stopping the two-way arms trade, like taking diplomatic action to say that this invasion needs to stop.
All right, yeah, I won't fact-check all of those assertions here, but I will just kind of close out today, Adam Bant, with, you'd be well aware because you heard it in the Parliament and elsewhere last week, Penny Wong, Anthony Albanese and others make the point that as a party leader, you have special responsibilities to nurture civil debate and political discourse in this country. I'm just wondering, as a leader, have you at any point issued advice to the broader Greens membership along these lines, imploring them to engage civilly and peacefully?
I've made it crystal clear for months now, using all the platforms that I've got available, that protest has to be peaceful and has to be peaceful with respect to people and to property. Everyone has a right to feel safe in this country. People who work for members of parliament, the general public, whatever their background, everyone has a right to feel safe in this country. And what we've said very, very clearly is that what we're seeing is the overwhelming majority of people coming out onto the streets and protesting peacefully. That has a long tradition in Australian politics. It's what's helped stop wars in the past. And I think that I've heard what the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition said last week, and I would say to them there's steps that they could take, including calling for action and putting pressure on the Israeli government to stop the invasion, that I think if people across the country heard that, they would say, thank you, that's what we've been calling on you to do. Join those other countries around the world who say they won't be part of the two-way weapons trade, who say they will put diplomatic pressure to bear to bring an end to this terrible invasion.
All right, noted, Adam Bant, and rest assured we'll continue to ask government figures about this and other matters when they come on the program too. We appreciate it, as always.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap up our hour now. Not quite the hour we'd originally planned for you due to Anthony Albanese's media conference. We mentioned at the beginning that we had planned to speak to Alison Scott. We've had to hold that over, partly to do justice to the topic we were going to talk to Alison about. She's just been appointed to a role with the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission, bringing her own lived experience of some considerable distress to that task. So yes, we'll hold that over and introduce Alison's story to you on the program on a future occasion. All right, all of this because of a large part of the hour being gobbled up by that live media conference. But yeah, more coming up with the ABC News team in just a moment, and we'll be back with you tomorrow.